So this is Acts chapter 7, the scripture for May 26th. And this chapter offers Stephen's defense to the Sanhedrin. In his defense, Stephen shows a deep familiarity with the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, along with the history, which takes you from Joshua all the way through maybe 2 Kings, maybe Ezra and Nehemiah, along with all the prophets and wisdom literature. He references and pulls these references out of his head as many as 30 times in his defense. The focus of Stephen's words, and I want you to read this passage with these words in mind, is this idea of resident aliens. Your translation may translate this Greek word into strangers or sojourners, but it's the same word. You can find it in verses 6 and 29 of this chapter. Now, a secondary focus of Stephen's speech is this rejection of Moses. Moses was the prophet that God called to lead the people to freedom, and how this mirrors the rejection of Jesus, also a prophet that God called to lead his people to freedom. Throughout Stephen's speech, he calls attention to how the children of Israel worshipped God while they were in enemy territory, so to speak. While in enemy territory, there's no social capital to be gained through worship. The only reason to worship is because God is worth worshiping. When the dominant culture worships, when worship of God becomes the practice of the rulers and the elite classes, many people choose to worship not because God is worth worshiping, but because of the networking opportunities that are provided in worship, or because there's societal pressure to conform with what the folks who are in power are doing. This is why those who live as resident aliens or strangers or sojourners, those who live behind enemy lines, as it were, often learn how to worship in deeper and more profound ways. When I was younger and I was in undergraduate, I went to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate. I was studying math, and so many people from my home church they pulled me aside, they said, "Hey, we're going to be praying for you." And I really appreciated that. But what I learned in Berkeley, it's a place that's traditionally thought of as hostile to the gospel, and yet there are pockets of deeply faithful Christians there, because in order to go to church, you have to want to go to church. There's not the societal pressure to go to church. You don't go to church because you can network. You go to church because you want to worship. I grew deeply in my faith in my time at Berkeley. Now, back to Stephen. In Stephen's reading of the history of Israel, the Hebrews exchange this uncomfortable existence of living as resident aliens, and they exchange it for uniformity with the surrounding nations, choosing kings instead of prophets, instead of serving God directly, choosing to build a temple instead of worshiping God in a tabernacle. By calling this temple a house made with human hands, Stephen is equating the temple with graven images or idols. He's specifically equating the temple with the idolatry of the golden calf. And just as the people of Israel rejected Moses for opposing idolatry, Stephen is making the argument that the Sanhedrin rejected Jesus for exposing their idolatry of the temple. Now, this parallel that Stephen draws enrages the Sanhedrin. And when Stephen then goes further and claims to see Jesus at God's right hand, they cover their ears, which was a symbol of saying, "This man is blaspheming, I don't want to hear it." And as a blasphemer, Stephen then receives a death sentence. And the Sanhedrin feels so strongly about this that they don't even check with Rome. They're technically not allowed to make a death sentence without Rome's okay, but they pick Stephen up and they drag him out of the city because all unrighteous people are directed to die outside of the city gates. And there they kill him by stoning him. And we're introduced at this point to Saul, a rather understated introduction for someone who's going to be very important later in the Acts of the Apostles. And Saul approves this first martyr of the early church. I wonder, when have you been a resident alien? How does your faith isolate you from the world? And that's all for Acts chapter 7. Tomorrow, the 27th of May, we'll be looking at Acts chapter 8. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.